Good morning, everyone. I was thinking about the pictures on the altar this morning. Back in the minister's room, we store a couple of very large photographs that we only bring out sometimes because they don't fit the everyday decor. So when we're getting ready, changing into these costumes that we wear for this event, there's a very large picture of Master, and there's also a very large picture of Swamiji. Swami's picture, the same as is up here. It's a different photo of Master when he was older. So we have Swamiji close to the end of his life and Master at the end of his life. And of course, one was Indian, one was American. Swami's eyes were blue, Master's were a rich brown color. Swami's hair was short and white, Master's was long and dark. You have all these different ways of distinguishing who was who. But still, when you look at the pictures, they look alike in a peculiar sort of way that you can't quite quantify, because the way we recognize people, the way we know who people are, is quite different than what we think. There's a very interesting story about a young French man who was blind, and he lived at the time of World War II in France. And he went blind sometime in his childhood, but he wasn't born that way. And when he lost his sight, I think it was from some unusual accident, like a blow to the head, his parents treated him, had the courage to treat him in a certain way. Because he was a child, he was very open to learning, and he wanted to have the opportunity to try to move through the world without all the usual accoutrements that a blind person would use. And his parents allowed him to practice on the farm and in the barn because he realized that when he was unable to see physically, he could still see. And what he could see was energy patterns and colors in front of his eyes. And he realized he went down the path that he had often walked, and he realized that he was seeing all the trees still, but he was seeing energy patterns now that he couldn't see physically. And he gradually learned that he could still negotiate this world in darkness from the point of view of what people would think of as sight, but he became attuned to the energy of things and of people and could still tell very clearly what was going on around him. Later on, he had adjusted so well to being blind that he was invited to try to cheer up a teenage boy who had also lost his sight. But when he went to talk to that boy, he wasn't able to help him, because when he said to that boy, "Have you noticed that you can still see?" the teenager said, "No, of course I can't see." And he realized that from the beginning, that young man had believed that he couldn't see anymore, and he couldn't. And somehow this other child had just believed what he saw. His parents believed him, and he was able to live on that. Peculiarly, in the way that God has these things, this man became part of the resistance against the Nazi regime, and he was able to tell who was lying and who wasn't, because he could see the energy. And so he became the gatekeeper for letting people into the resistance, because anybody who was trying to infiltrate, this man could tell. Isn't that amazing? And what it also begins to tell us is how much more is going on when we communicate and when we relate and when we move in this world than we actually know. I had the experience about a decade ago. We were assaulted by lawyers in various ways, and on a couple of occasions, I had to have a deposition taken. Now, my trade, so to speak, is communication. So the lawyers had to train me really carefully that when you're being questioned by the opposition, communication is not the goal. You simply don't tell them anything they don't actually ask. And he had to teach us, and it was not so easy to get that, to listen only to the words and to respond only to the words. And it became so apparent to me in that exercise that we don't listen to words. We feel vibrations, we sense intentions, we get the energy of people, and in my own life, I always respond, I try to respond to what they want to know. And of course, the Lord had to step on my foot on a number of occasions until I just completely shifted my brain so that I just heard literal words, and I answered with literal words. And I was a great witness for our side. They didn't depose me very long because there wasn't much they could get from me. But I also realized how different we really are functioning in this world than we realize. And there's another factor here which is such an important one in the reading that we're talking about today. And Master emphasizes this in Autobiography of a Yogi. He has a line in there that is really the whole book. He says, our thoughts are not created individually. We live inside our own heads in this certain privacy. And even, as Master said, even God and Guru will not invade that privacy without an invitation. Swamiji was a dedicated disciple of Master, of Yogananda, and Swamiji gave several instances in which, even at a distance, Master was completely aware of what Swamiji had said and would correct him for making errors that Master had no way of knowing except by his intuitive connection. And when Swamiji was surprised, Master said, I know every thought that you're thinking. And Swamiji said he demonstrated it frequently, that he really did. Well, Swamiji said the first response might be one of extreme embarrassment. We really enjoy the privacy of our own minds, most of us. But then Swamiji said he wanted Master to know everything he was thinking, because he wanted every thought to be turned in the direction of upward moving spirituality. Swamiji was of a level of spiritual development where he really wanted to give up everything else. Now, Master knew that and therefore responded accordingly. But with those disciples, any of us at this time, because the gurus are not inhibited by time, space, or death, we will be as open and as transparent to God and gurus as we wish to be. And it isn't just a question of fervent prayers and articulating really dynamic statements. It's really a question of the courage of our own hearts. You know, how willing are we now, at this point in our life, to really abide with God? And how much do we enjoy just abiding with all those other mental citizens who hang out in there with us and sort of tell us that we're sort of interested in the spiritual path. Now, I was listening to a talk. Swami Kriyananda has done these short radio, television, YouTube videos. It's called Ask Me About Truth. And he set them up as a conversation between himself and this couple that's been with Ananda for a long time, Dharmadas and Nirmala, longtime friends of Swamiji's. But they sort of played it like Dharmadas and Nirmala were more ignorant than they are, so they asked questions of Swamiji that people who were newer might ask. So Dharmadas, the man there, tried to ask Swamiji a question like, what if you really want to change on the spiritual path, but part of you doesn't want to change, and then some of you does want to change, but the other part doesn't? He explained it like this, and Swami looked at him and says, I don't understand that question at all. So he started again with, you want to admit that you're wrong, but you don't really want to admit that you're wrong. And again, Swami laughed and said, just sort of, he didn't know how to relate to it. But then he answered simply, well, before you can make any progress in life, you have to work with what is. You have to accept reality as it is before you can begin to change it. That was the closest he could come to answering that question. Now, I was reflecting on it later, because, of course, Swamiji's perception of reality is very simple, which is the joy that we're seeking lies comes from divine attunement. And all the misery we experience comes when we are out of tune with the divine. And so as that conversation went further, this particular episode, Swami's answer was really simple. Well, I guess if you feel that way, you haven't suffered enough yet. And he said, that's the point of suffering. The point of suffering is to teach us the consequences of our own behavior. And the law of karma, which is what that's about, is really extremely simple. It gets very complicated because we're complicated. But the principle of karma is really very simple. We are made in a certain way. And when we cooperate with the way that we are made, then everything flows harmoniously. And when we rebel against the way that we are made and try to make our own rules, then sooner or later the consequences of that behavior rolls over us. And we have two choices when we suffer. We can either be even more angry about what's going on and even more determined to make our way work, or we can ask a very sincere question. What am I doing wrong? What have I not yet understood? And more profoundly, we can ask God to enlighten us. We can invite the Master into our own awareness, and we can say, show me. But you see, for some of us, we haven't suffered enough. And the pleasure of holding on to what we're familiar with, to our own little habits. I watch my own little habits. Habits are so darling. I just really enjoy them. Oh, here's my little cup of tea, and I carry it over, and I sit in the sun, and I read my little book, and then I go upstairs, and I do my little this, and I do my little that. And we sort of get into these ways of being. And this is what I think about these things, and these are the people I like, and this is why I like them, and that person is icky because, and this one really needs to get his life in order according to my idea of what it looks like to have his life in order. And there you have it. You know, we're just always playing these out. Where do these thoughts come from? This is what Master is saying in Autobiography of a Yogi. Where do these thoughts come from? Where does even the idea that this is pleasurable come from? We're not the creators of our own reality. We are part of this infinite whole. And at any time, we are operating. I've never myself been to the Grand Canyon, but I've seen lots of pictures of the geologic strata that are revealed in the Grand Canyon because the excavation has been so deep, and they can read all these different ages, all the different things that happen. So are we. I always think of it like this. Between pure materialism and absolute ego and divine freedom, there are all these geologic stratas. And when we tune in, wherever we tune in, there's a whole world that we can go. And if this is where we live, this is what we see. And this is what we enjoy, and this is what we consider pleasurable. This is what we consider fashionable. You know, as a woman of a certain age as I am, I've now stepped out of fashion altogether by becoming a Nayaswami. But I enjoyed so much how the mind freezes at a certain point, and this is what you think looks good. Years ago, when we had lived in the mountains for a decade, and we were going to go down and start the center in San Francisco, and we had lived with no money and complete country living. So we just had no fashion at all, but we had no money, but we needed city clothes. So we went to the local thrift store and were amazed by the gorgeous things we could buy. And we went down to San Francisco, and we were so sharp. Men and women, we were so sharp. After a few months, one of the city residents told us that we looked really great for exactly 1 decade earlier. And that we just looked peculiar, was the only way she could put it. We were neatly dressed and nicely dressed, but we looked peculiar because all of us had frozen at the geologic strata, which was 10 years earlier, the last time we noticed. And of course, that's why all our favorite clothes were in the thrift store, because other people had gone on. So we're always influenced by something. Fashion, to me, I figured that out when I was about 15. I didn't know about used clothing stores then. I realized that we all dressed the way somebody was telling us to dress. That if we'd lived in, I'm sorry, if we'd lived in France a few centuries earlier, we would have looked completely different. You know, American Indians looked a certain way. There was some force that told us that this is who we were supposed to be. So what I'm saying is, don't ever imagine that we're choosing. You know, we're not freely choosing until the ego is completely conquered and all desires are gone. We are always tuning into something, some idea of who we're supposed to be. So the question is simply, what do we wish to tune into? Freedom is not an option until the ego is conquered, as I said. We're always going according to certain preferences. And the greatest challenge on the spiritual path was what my friend was trying to ask Swamiji. What if we're of two minds about this, or three minds, or four minds, or seven minds? Because we have so many different pieces. But here's what the scriptures have always told us, and the masters have always told us. Look to the highest source that you can find. And always be aware of the fact that we are never separated, except by our own choice. The master comes into us as much as we want him to. And the privacy of our own minds will be an open book to God and gurus as much as we want it to. When I was younger on the path and was going through a very difficult dilemma, having a very hard time feeling God's will for me, I learned through a not too painful process that whenever I was confused, it was always because I was afraid. I was afraid that something I was attached to would be taken away from me. And that's an honest place to be. It may not be where we want to be, but it's an honest place to be. And the most powerful single principle for being able to be in tune with God is to work with things as they are. And that's how Swami finally answered Dharmadas's question. Oh, well, we have to work with things as they are. And the balance on the spiritual path is to be able to push the boundaries, your actual real boundaries. Whatever your real boundaries are, always be pushing just a little bit beyond them. A man who was a great prosperity guru who believed greatly in tithing, in donating a percentage of your income to spiritual causes, to the source of your spiritual inspiration. The tradition is 10%. Some people easily rise to that. Some people don't have the courage. His principle was very simple. If it doesn't make you nervous every time you write that tithing check, he said the check isn't big enough. Because wherever you are, do we want to just sort of comfortably sit there and say, well, this is good enough for me? How much happiness do we have? How in tune are we with divine law? How much are we suffering? And how much more do we want to suffer? By attunement with the divine, the result of that always is happiness. I was reading some old letters that Swamiji had written to me from many, many years ago. And I realized how often his closing advice to me was, be happy. And even though I think of myself, generally speaking, as a happy person, I do remember all those years of having such a difficult time adjusting to the discrepancy between who I wanted to be and who I actually was. And you might say I was stuck in the geologic strata that says, it doesn't matter, you're not good enough. So therefore, you really can't just be open-hearted and happy in God's presence because of look at all these things that you haven't yet accomplished. And I gradually began to understand that, well, first of all, until we're absolutely free, we're always going to be just fraught with failures. Even the greatest of saints are still conscious of their limitations. But the difference is, what do we tune into? Do we tune into God's presence holding our hand taking us step by step out of whatever our limitations are, showing us where our happiness really, really lies, or do we cling to where we already are? Richard Bach, who was a sort of a pop culture guru and was pretty good at it, actually, he said really well, if you're attached to your limitations and fight to defend them, the reward for that is you get to keep them, which I've always really loved. And every time I find myself trying to justify why I can't do this and why I can only do that and why I'm not ready to do this, I think to myself, what is this going to get you except this, really? And even if you have to just stand back and say, Lord, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You know, sometimes the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. That's Jesus' words to his own disciples, meaning we mean well, but we're not good enough yet, Lord. But I want to tune into your power that will make me free, instead of my own hypnosis that there's no way I'm ever going to get out of this. As Swamiji once said, if you've got the karma, someone asked him once, what is your dharma? What is those actions that will take you to freedom? He said, well, if you're next in line and it needs to be done, then it's probably your job to do it. And we can just look around at the lives we're living and ask ourselves not, how can I have a life other than this one, but how can I do this one more beautifully for God? How can I make even these little habits a companionship rather than a separation? To all who received him, John told us about Jesus, to all who received him, he gave us the power that we could become like him. And so wherever we're standing, just make it a little more beautiful, a little more in tune, a little more open. And you'd be amazed how the doorways of the infinite will just open out before us.